on our behalf today. Eric laid a little groundwork for what Jennifer and I will be talking about, but I also want to add to that a bit. You need to know that from GCO's perspective, all our work derives from our belief that every individual has inherent dignity, inherent worth. And so when we think about our work and we think about public policy, we think about what it means, perhaps, as a phrase you'll be familiar with, what it means to rob someone of their dignity. What does it mean to rob someone of their human dignity? We may use that phrase, excuse me, a fair amount, but I'm not sure we necessarily have a clear idea of what it means to rob someone of their dignity. And the way we think about it is in terms of what it means to be human. Now that may sound esoteric, philosophical, theological, but I think when I describe 4 things that we look at, and there's a lot more that could be discussed, but when you hear the 4 things that we look at, when we think about what it means to be human, you'll recognize them. You'll recognize them because it's true about yourself, it's true about your own longings and your own desires. It's true about the longings and desires of your kids and the longings and desires that you have for your kids and perhaps grandkids. So, 4 things. Number 1, what it means to be human. We're wired for relationships. There's a reason why virtually every story that captures our imagination is about relationship. I watched a movie the other night by Interstellar. Maybe you've seen it. I don't know what Chris Nolan was trying to do with that movie. I may not be as sophisticated as I need to be. However, the reason why it mattered, the story mattered, was because of the relationship within the story, right? That's why it kept my attention. That's true of most stories that capture our attention. It's the reason why, for most of us, we probably prefer a broken bone over a broken heart. Because a broken heart signifies a broken relationship, and that actually hurts far more and is more lasting, usually, than a broken bone. There's a reason why the severest form of punishment, short of capital punishment, is solitary confinement. It hurts to be alone. It hurts to be alone, whether it's in a prison cell or in our homes, our communities. It hurts to be alone. We are wired for relationships. So that's number 1. Number 2, we're wired for meaning and purpose. We want to know that we matter, that what we do matters. And related to that, and again, I'll use perhaps a bit of a theological term, but it doesn't necessarily need to be understood solely that way. But we're wired for dominion. We want to have some sort of domain for which we're responsible. Put differently, we want to know that the success of someone or something depends on us. That's just true of what it means to be human. We want to know that. And finally, the 4th thing I'd mention is we're wired for earned success. Put differently, we want to enjoy the fruits of our labor. We want to do something that produces fruit, that then in us produces a sense of joy and gives us an opportunity to enjoy the fruits of our labor. So those are the 4 things we think of. Believe me, we could spend a week talking about what it means to be human. So what I just did is probably awful to bring up such a topic, but we have to frame it in some way, because as Jennifer and I start talking about what it means to go from welfare to opportunity, we're thinking about what it means to go from welfare to opportunity to human flourishing, to be able to experience a life that looks like this, that is characterized by healthy relationships, that's characterized by meaning and purpose, by the exercise of dominion, and by the opportunity to earn success and to enjoy the fruits of our labor. So when it comes to the anti-poverty programs, you need to know that from GCO's perspective, the biggest issue is not necessarily a constitutional one, which may be there, and some would argue there is. It's not necessarily a spending one, though I'm terribly concerned about the growth rate of the programs. The biggest issue we should be concerned about is whether or not those programs interfere with someone's dignity, whether or not those programs are dehumanizing in any way. So when we think about these programs, we're looking at moving forward and moving people into a place where they can flourish. Do our policies do that? How do we change our policies to accomplish that? Those are some of the things Jennifer and I will be talking about. So with that, let me introduce Jennifer. Jennifer is the Vice President at the Heritage Foundation for the Institute of Family, Community, and Opportunity. In that role, she runs the Think Tanks Institute. In that role, she explores issues that range from marriage, life, and religious liberty to health, education, and welfare. So she's very well suited to talk about the things we're going to be talking about here. She also edits Heritage's annual Index of Culture and Opportunity, which tracks key social and economic trends to determine whether important indicators of opportunity in America are on the right track. In 2010, National Journal named Jennifer one of Washington's 20 power players in recognition of her work on school choice and other education reforms, which, as Eric and Jamie pointed out, is one of our major areas of interest as well. Before joining Heritage in 2003, she worked on policy issues at Empower America, the organization that was founded by Jean Kirkpatrick, Jack Kemp, and Bill Bennett. And before that, she was Director of Family Studies at the Family Research Council. She also taught in an American school in France. She has written all sorts of things, and I don't want to take any more time away from our discussion. I will say this. Jennifer is one of my and GCO's closest friends in the public policy world. She is smart and thoughtful, and I think you're going to really be blessed to hear her thoughts about where we go. So, Jennifer, please join me. All right. The first thing I'm going to do is put a slide. Okay, that's already up there. Somebody controlling it for me? Or did I accidentally do it? All right. I'm going to, oh, my notebook is on the computer. That's how that happened. So, I don't know if you can see that. Chances are it's probably a little dark. It is. But if you look at this line from the top left down here, represents the percentage of children born to married parents. So in 1950, it was 96 out of 100. You can't necessarily see that. Slides were going to be separate. Apparently they're coming up together. But it was 96 out of 100 kids were born to married parents. Even in 1964, with the passage of the Great Society legislation of Lyndon Johnson, it was at 93%. So it was 93 out of 100 kids were born to married parents. Today, it's at about 59. So 59 out of 100 kids are born to married parents. The other graph overlaying it is welfare spending. So in 1950, welfare spending was under $5 billion. Now it's well up over $700 billion. So Jennifer, I want to start with this question. You look at those graphs, they speak to a lot of trends, a lot of social changes, and I'm just curious, what trends do you see there? What does that tell us about what's going on in the past, really, 2 generations?
Well, thank you, all of you, for being here, and it's a great pleasure to join Randy and GCO in any project, but particularly this conversation, because it reflects years of interaction that we've had on these themes, and ones that we really are concerned with Americans paying more attention to, and our policymakers doing the same. Am I on? Are we here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody hear her okay?
Yeah. So one of the things that this graph shows, this set of tables shows, is the wrong diagnosis that we have had of poverty in America. We've just passed the 50-year mark on 2 important events in the mid-60s. The first was the inauguration of the War on Poverty by President Lyndon Johnson. And the second was the Moynihan Report, just last month, March of 1965. Then Labor Department official Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who went on to be a senator in the United States Senate, expressed alarm at the fact that 25% of black children were born outside of marriage. And he was alarmed at that, rightly so, because he was concerned about what that meant for their opportunity. Well, today, as we've just been looking at here, the unwed childbearing rate for the entire population is 40%. So 4 out of 10 children are born to an unmarried mother. And for blacks, it is more than 7 out of 10 children born to an unmarried mother. Well, that's going to cast a significant shadow down the course of a child's life. One thing I should say at the outset is that data is not destiny. We should not take a statistic like that in the aggregate and assign it as the fate of any one child. But we should recognize the odds, and that the odds are difficult when you are born into a single parent family. And that's something that the rest of us owe to those children to talk about and to try to restore the best opportunity for all children in America. So interestingly, back to that other date in the mid-1960s, President Johnson had the right idea. I'm a conservative. I don't like the war on poverty model at all, and I hope to understand why in a few minutes. But he actually did want people to be self-sufficient. He didn't want them to be on the dole generation after generation. The speeches he gave at that time were very much about helping people out of poverty. And yet the system he created has been one of intergenerational dependence on government programs. And the reason is, it was set up with incentives that created that dependency. The welfare system was set up in a way that you could continue to get checks from the government so long as you, as a single mother, did not get a job and didn't marry a man with a job. We'll talk about perverse incentives that are going to set you off in the wrong direction in life. Not at all in the direction of the success sequence that Eric was referring to earlier. And that aspect of the welfare state, the war on poverty, has led us to the place where we have now spent $22 trillion on the war on poverty. That's more than all the wars in American history combined. And yet the poverty rate today is just about as high as it was when the war on poverty began. So we have failed. And if we were going to win this war with spending, we would have done it a long time ago. That means there's something else going on. And I want to point us back to that relational diagnosis that you were talking about, that Moynihan was right to point out as the beginning of solving what has not been solved by the war on poverty for the last 50 years.
Okay. Jennifer, we've talked kind of definitely on kind of the negative side, right? I mean, we talked about the things that have gone wrong, why things aren't working out for such a high percentage of the American people. But what are those things? Let's talk about the success sequence a little bit more. What are those things that we know to be true about those who are more likely to succeed? And before you answer that, let me say this. Thank you for saying data is not destiny. We often say this at GCO. Somebody being raised in a fragmented family or an impoverished area or anything like that, it doesn't guarantee that they are going to end up in a lifelong trajectory of misery and failure. That isn't what that means. Just as it doesn't mean that somebody born to an intact family is guaranteed success. So data is not destiny. Thank you for saying that, but let's talk a little bit about that. What are those things that typically are in place and increase the likelihood of someone succeeding?
Yeah. So the success sequence is kind of the term that's been coined for this. Interestingly, coined by researchers at the Brookings Institution, not conservatives. And that shows the agreement. When we have an honest debate, there is agreement across the ideological spectrum on the importance of family for fighting poverty, the importance of marriage for fighting poverty, which is an idea we'll explore throughout this conversation. But that success sequence in particular is built around 3 things. Number 1, graduating from high school, getting a job, and getting married before having a child. And accomplishing those 3 things in life radically reduce the chances of poverty. I've talked about the unwed childbearing rate. The rate, a child born outside of marriage is 5 times more likely to experience poverty than one born and raised in an intact family. That's a dramatic difference. And if our poverty conversation does not engage that kind of fact on the ground, we are missing the point. We are reducing the conversation to a materialist understanding of what poverty is. rather than understanding that in poverty in America, and I do distinguish it from poverty in the developing world, poverty in America has a high correlation with the breakdown of marriage in particular, with the breakdown of community, with the absence of work and the work ethic. The developing world, by contrast, has really often very concrete material need, lack of basic systems, lack of the sustenance to stay alive from one day to the next. Malnourishment is not the problem here in the United States. We have, by contrast, obesity problems in the food stamp population. What we do have, and it's not a lack of material needs. There is a high, we see a lot of benefits going into families households categorized as poor by the federal government. But that is not that's not solving the problem. It is not repairing the roots of the relational challenges that equip us. And we call this social capital in social science jargon, kinds of social capital that are needed to strive after opportunity.
Good. One of the things that Eric mentioned, and one of the things that we talk about a lot, is moving people from dependency to self-sufficiency, largely because we believe in just about anybody's heart of hearts, that's where they want to be. They want to be living in that place in accordance with that description I gave earlier of what it means to be human. Raj Chetty from Harvard University, along with some colleagues from Harvard and from Berkeley, put out a study on social mobility about a year and a half ago. It was an outstanding study. I think the results surprised them. But it focused in on what are the conditions at the community level that produce higher levels of social economic mobility. Can you talk a little bit about that study and really the significance of it, probably for the debate today, and not just by the debate or the discussion today in this room, but for the country more broadly?
Yeah, it was a powerful study, and one reason it really pointed to the significance of family for upward mobility, and particularly looking at all these different factors of school quality and segregation and other factors in a community. And that was important. They were looking not just at individual characteristics, but at community characteristics. The most salient factor for mobility was the proportion of children living in single-parent homes. It was negative, had a negative impact on mobility. And so that family aspect is so powerful and potent for achieving mobility that, and it was incredible to see it in this multivariate study, that is very sophisticated and looking at all kinds of relationships between the various factors that influence mobility. And I think it did surprise them, and some of the conversation afterwards has been surprising. To remind people again, and it seems like about every decade we have a reminder of this. There was a really good, strong breakthrough in the mid-1990s that produced the welfare reform of 1996 because of this same awareness that, the family and marriage in particular has a lot to do with poverty, and has a lot to do with the rise in the welfare state. The breakdown of marriage has a lot to do with the growth of the welfare state. We want to start changing that. We've got to be concerned about the direction of family stability in America.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that study is they mentioned a number of things that it's almost as if our work at GCO kind of mirrored their plan in the sense that it starts with family, heavy emphasis on school quality. It does talk about the problem, the negative impact of economic and racial segregation, which is often talked about for those poverty fighters out there, that oftentimes when you concentrate poverty, it's harder to fight poverty. So they talked about that. One thing they talked about that I thought was also very interesting is that they emphasized the importance of social capital. So for us, we often talk about civil society, our churches and our nonprofits, but that was a huge indicator of success as well. Robert Putnam, who teaches at Harvard as well, has written a lot on social capital. He says half of all of social capital. Roughly half is religious based. But talk a little bit about that. Why are the institutions of civil society so important? The cities of refuge, the FCS urban ministries. We have, a couple board members from there here this morning. This afternoon? Why are those things so important? How does it work?
We aren't just isolated individuals. We are relational, and that means that these associations, these groups in which we come together, are powerfully shaping in our lives. And the absence is powerful and detrimental to us. That begins with the family, of course. Very significantly, the church, the congregation, is a huge factor in common good outcomes. And then all kinds of civic associations and groupings and affinity groups that we participate in. These are a powerful expression of what it is to be relational, and therefore they have a massive effect on us. One of the just very common sense when you think about it, reasons that these are important for social capital is the fact that they offer lots of opportunities to get that opportunity, that next chance, that job. Think about all the ways that we benefited from a dad, co-workers, cousins, internship to get our first job. Or somebody let you mow their lawn and trusted you with that. And we get our start through these kind of connections like third and fourth degree. But if you don't have those dense networks of connections through a church, through a family, through the extended family, you're going to be less likely to be able to trip into those things. I think probably all of us in our own life history would describe at least one of the major steps in our lives as sort of seemingly to us tripping into that because of a contact, because of a connection, a relationship that we've had. But if we're impoverished in those relational connections, those are much less likely to happen. So social capital is a powerful concept. I know it's a little bit academic, but I think the more we explore that realm of ideas, the better we will help policymakers arrive at the right kind of solutions.
All right, so let's move to public policy a little bit. Our goal there in talking about the things we've talked about so far was to kind of talk a lot about preventative medicine to some degree. What's a success sequence? In a community, what are the solutions? We've talked a little bit, not in any great detail, but the fact that social capital matters as well as families. Let's talk about public policy, all right? Because obviously that slide up there shows the growth of welfare spending specifically tied to a specific public policy. First question for you is, how should government measure success when it comes to anti-poverty legislation and programs? How should we measure success?
So one of the things we've done at the Heritage Foundation, Randy mentioned the Index of Culture and Opportunity that we produced. Last year was the first year, and it'll come out again this summer. We are measuring 31 indicators of opportunity in America. And the opportunity discussion typically starts with economic data. How's the GDP, what, job hires, those kinds of things. Maybe sometimes it includes education. But we felt like if you're going to have a full conversation about opportunity, for all the reasons we've just been talking about, you've got to be talking about the family, you've got to be talking about the culture. So we brought in these other 20 indicators on the culture and religious practice and community strength and so on. Together they form this index of culture and opportunity. And the reason we wanted to do that was to be able to say that, and I wanted to talk about one indicator in that index in particular to demonstrate this. The poverty rate is a kind of squirrely thing at the federal level because it is, and what we did was to flip the concept of that in the index to show that what it's really measuring is the capacity to live self-sufficient without dependence on government services. That's what the poverty rate is really measuring. It's not really measuring destitution as many Americans would picture it. When you talk about poverty to most Americans, I think we have a picture of really not knowing where the next couple of meals are coming from, not having a roof over your head, really being concerned about your livelihood for the future. And that's not characteristic of most households who are defined as poor by the federal government. They have a pretty significant degree of material goods, the typical poor family. That's not to say there is not extreme deprivation in America. it happens, but typically when it happens, it's happening because of some other anomaly. It is not characteristic of poverty as a whole. So, what the poverty rate is really telling us, and what we characterized it as in this index, is the self-sufficiency rate. And so that rate is telling us whether individuals and households are able to support themselves without recourse to federal benefits, to government welfare programs. And that rate, as I said before, has not improved since 1965. In other words, we failed at that key goal that President Johnson had when initially launching the war on poverty. And that means that we need to start measuring success by whether the safety net actually points people towards self-sufficiency. Now, I think Americans are generous people. I think we want to make sure that our neighbors have somewhere to turn. And if they don't have that network that I was just talking about, that there is a safety net to catch them. And that's something we've been willing to do with our tax dollars to some extent. But that is not what the federal poverty, anti-poverty system is doing today. It is much more, rather than a safety net, it has become an ensnaring mess, an entangling mess that people get caught up in year after year, decade after decade even, generation after generation. And so how do we change the incentive structure within those programs to make sure that we are pointing towards independence, pointing people towards the American dream, and giving them equipping them in the way that they can pursue that.
Good, great. So when it comes down to it, what they ought to be measuring is, just if I can sum it up, is are people being moved from dependency to self-sufficiency? Again, it's kind of how we talk about things at GCO, but that's essentially what you're saying. That should be the measurement. Now, someone we both respect, Arthur Brooks, has often said we need to, no longer wage war. We conservatives need to no longer wage war against the safety net. For a long time, conservatives wanted to wipe out the safety net. What's your reaction to that? How do we move forward with that in mind? You hinted at it, just what you just said.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
So with any of these, I think it's really important to define our terms. And I would define a safety net as a place of last resort when there is no place to turn to help people get back up on their feet. That's what a safety net ought to do. Make sure there is food and housing and basic medical care and some cash to be able to get back up on your feet. But those programs should be built around incentives like a work requirement, so that if you're able-bodied, you are getting a job, looking for work, preparing for work, doing something that is pointing you on the path towards self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
Good.
Jennifer, you've jumped into characteristics of what we believe are good, what would be good legislation, good public policy. But let's talk a little bit about welfare reform in 1996. So, and many of you have heard this story in the past. In the late 80s, early 90s, Tommy Thompson was governor of Wisconsin, and he received a number of waivers from the federal government to create kind of his own welfare program. Basically said, hold us accountable for results, not for what we do, but hold us accountable for results. A novel idea. It's probably the way it should be done. They had good results. Talk about kind of that trajectory, what happened in Wisconsin, and then ultimately what happened with welfare reform in 1996, and the results.
Yeah. So this reflects the importance of cooperation between national and state policymakers and policy think tanks, and why I prize the relationship with GCO at the Heritage Foundation is because so often the way to get to reform is an iterative process between the federal government and the state government. And what was going on in the case of Wisconsin was there were people in Washington that were looking at that and trying to elicit the kind of good action by the state. The state of Wisconsin was a willing example of that, produced a very strong work requirement that did just exactly what I was saying, required people to get a job, look for a job, prepare for work, put them on the path to self-sufficiency. Massive reduction of the rolls in the state of Wisconsin. And then that was the model that was implemented then for the nation in the largest cash assistance program at the federal level. That was at the time called the Aid to Families with Dependent Children. It was transitioned into something called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or TANF. And you get right in the name the ethos of the reform, temporary assistance. That's the safety net that I believe. It's a temporary assistance to needy families. Put that work requirement in place. And the results were incredible. The rolls nationwide, welfare rolls nationwide were reduced by half. And you could say, well, that's no good if you're tossing people out to suffer in the streets on their own without assistance, and that would be true. Except that at the very same time, Black child poverty reached its lowest level in history. Single mother poverty. There were reductions in all the important and critical categories that you wanted to see results in. And it was an enormous success, such a success, that across the ideological spectrum, people agreed that it was very impressive. I don't know if you remember at the Saddleback debate that Rick Warren hosted when Senator Obama was running for president. He asked him, what's one thing you've gotten wrong? This was the thing that President Obama, Senator Obama said at the time. I was wrong about welfare reform. It worked. It didn't have the dire consequences that I thought. That's an important breakthrough when we've got the success to show that this works. Now, the glass half full side of the story is that was just one program of 80 federal needs-tested programs providing cash, food, housing assistance, medical assistance, and social services to the poor. Just one of 80 federal programs like that. And the results were dramatic when we put a work requirement in there, when we restructured the incentives. But now we've got to start restructuring the incentives in food stamps, in public housing, in the variety of programs that are out there, so that we can, the states are then helping people transition back into gainful employment and the thriving community life that we want for all Americans.
So Jennifer, talk a little bit more about the status of that welfare reform change, right, from back in the late 90s. Where are we with that now? What's happened to other programs? That's created some shifts. Talk about what's happened since.
Yeah. Well, sadly, candidate Obama has not followed through as President Obama, and he's actually done a number of things to undermine the work requirement in the TANF program. So rather than building on that success into these other programs, this administration has been an opponent of further transformation of the welfare system. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, there have been some reform-minded members of Congress who have introduced legislation that would institute a work requirement in food stamps and make sure that we're, on condition of public assistance, we're also expecting people to be able to help themselves. That's the kind of deal, the reciprocal agreement that should be at the heart of welfare assistance, at the heart of the safety net. The other really incredibly important factor is whether the welfare programs are undermining marriage. Are they sending a negative message about marriage, as has so often happened in the structured welfare programs? The reason for that is that there is a marriage penalty built into almost all of these programs that I'm talking about. That is that your benefits will be reduced if you're a single parent, if you're particularly single moms, it's the most typical situation. You're a single mom and you marry a man with a job and your income pops up above the threshold for receiving benefits, you're suddenly out of benefits. Well, that policy becomes a reason, one of the reasons that you might not get married. You might just live with a guy and never marry him. And this contributes to the instability that is characteristic of low-income homes and that contributes to the unwed childbearing problem. So reducing those marriage penalties. Right now we have a cliff. Smoothing it out so that it's not such a radical jolt to a would-be, someone who might walk down the aisle otherwise. Making sure that we reduce those marriage penalties in programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit is a good place to start. We ought to explore what it would look like elsewhere. The really great way to do this would be to have a governor take this strategy right now, because there's nothing preventing the governor from doing this, and starting to work to promote marriage and to explore how to get rid of marriage penalties in some of these welfare programs.
Yeah, going back to my comments earlier about what it means to be human, and I listed those 4 things. One of the concerns about these public policies is that they really do undermine many of those longings. They discourage marriage, as Jennifer has just said. So they discourage that relationship building. They often discourage work, discourage saving, discourage all sorts of things that would actually enrich an individual's life. So there are some policy changes that need to be made, and policy changes that we at the state level can start working on even now with governors, Jennifer has said. One of the things that really jumps out about what you've said, if I could just comment, is that there are a couple things here. One is there's actually a lot of common ground on these issues across party lines. When I say that, though, it's probably better to say it's the non-political type, it's the non-politicians. People who study the issue recognize that things need to change. Getting those policy changes to take is an entirely different thing altogether. But one of the things that Jennifer and I have talked about, and we've talked about at GCO, is that the original intent of a lot of these bills were good. It was to truly help people. One of the stories that we often tell is that the first, and many of you native Atlantans may know this, but the first federal housing project was the brainchild of an Atlanta businessman back in the 30s. He knew FDR, went to FDR and said, I've got an idea. Let's create this place where families essentially in transition, in a difficult place, can come and land, get their lives stabilized, and then move on. And he emphasized to FDR at the time that it needed to be temporary, because if it wasn't, it would create all sorts of problems. FDR, in selling it to Congress and the public, said the very same thing. It needed to be temporary. Fast forward to the early 90s when Renee Glover, and you know some of the story, Renee Glover became the head of the Atlanta Housing Authority. She went into Techwood Homes, the oldest housing project, federal housing project in America, and found them holding celebrations for individuals based on how long they had lived there. It's the complete opposite of the really good intent